Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about how to use commas correctly. Commas are really challenging for a lot of people in English because they have so many jobs. There are so many things that a comma can do that it makes it difficult to determine when and when not to use one. Today we are not going to go into all of the different rules that govern comma usage, but we are going to talk about the 6 most essential rules. And if you're able to master these rules, chances are that you will be able to use commas effectively at least like 95% of the time, maybe even more than that. So with all of that said, here's the first rule. Use commas to separate independent clauses when they are joined by a coordinating conjunction. Now, those of you who are familiar with the different types of sentences, what we are talking about here are compound sentences. So a compound sentence has 2 independent clauses or 2 complete thoughts that are joined into one. In our example, you can see we went to the park. That is a complete thought by itself. It could be a sentence on its own. It is an independent clause. Then we have, but we didn't end up playing basketball. We didn't end up playing basketball, again, is an independent clause. And what we're doing here is we're combining 2 independent clauses into one sentence. So when we do that, we are going to put a comma and a coordinating conjunction, a fanboy, between those 2 independent clauses. That is rule number 1 for using commas. Now, rule number 2 is that we are going to use commas after introductory clauses, phrases, or words that come before the main clause of the sentence. And for this rule, you should think about complex sentences. In our example, we have the sentence that says, because her alarm clock was broken, she was late for class. Now, our sentence has a dependent clause at the beginning, because her alarm clock was broken, followed by an independent clause, she was late for class. Our dependent clause means that we are going to need a comma between the 2. Now, for a dependent clause plus an independent clause, we do not need a coordinating conjunction or a fanboy between those. We just use the comma. One really good way to find out if you are using an introductory phrase or a dependent clause at the beginning is to look for subordinating conjunctions. Our word because is a subordinating conjunction, which means that it is going to start a dependent clause. It wouldn't make sense to just end our sentence right after broken, because her alarm clock was broken. And because that doesn't make sense on its own, we know that we're going to need a comma after it. Now notice here that the comma comes after broken. It does not come after the word because. So in order to use commas correctly in this case, you need to figure out where your introductory phrase or clause ends, and then the comma comes at the end of that introductory phrase or clause. Rule number 3. Whenever you have extra information that is added to the middle of a sentence, you are going to use a pair of commas to offset that extra information. So here's our example. This restaurant has an exciting atmosphere. The food, on the other hand, is rather bland. So in that second sentence, the underlined portion, on the other hand, that is extra information for our sentence. We could take that chunk of the sentence out and the sentence would still make sense. We could still say the food is rather bland. That works on its own. What we've done here is we've just added extra information into the middle of it to help with a transition. However, it isn't necessary. And so when we're putting information into a sentence that isn't necessary, just like we did here, we are going to put a comma before and after that non-essential information. So the best way to find this is typically to read our sentences out loud. When we run into extra information, usually we pronounce those a little bit differently. So the food, on the other hand, is rather bland. You can hear it that way. Now, if hearing it doesn't work for you either, what you need to do is you need to figure out what the main clause of the sentence is, and you're going to do that by identifying the verb. Now, the verb in that second sentence is, and what we are doing is we are saying the food is rather bland, so we have a to be verb, and that is the necessary component right there. And so once we've identified the necessary components, the subject and the verb, well, then now it's going to be a lot easier to tell that on the other hand is just extra information. So again, rule number 3, when you put extra information into the middle of a sentence, you are going to put commas on both sides of that extra information. Rule number 4. Use commas to separate 3 or more words, phrases, or clauses written in a list. So whenever you write a list, you are going to put commas between the items. Here's our example. The candidate promised to lower taxes, comma, protect the environment, comma, reduce crime, comma, and end unemployment. Notice that there is a comma between all of those. Now, this brings up a really important point. That last comma that you see between crime and, that comma is known as the Oxford comma. And there's a little bit of debate about the Oxford comma. Some people will say that we do not need a comma between crime and. And if you're really interested in hot button grammar issues, this is a good one for you. This is an ongoing debate. So some people say that there should be a comma there. Some people say that there should not be a comma there. I always advocate for the Oxford comma. So I believe that there should be a comma there. Let me tell you why. First off, most tests are going to require that you put a comma there. So if you're worried about the SAT test, if you're worried about the ACT test, those tests require that a comma goes in that last position. Additionally, I believe that it adds clarity to our sentence. To add more commas, it helps reduce confusion. And so I always recommend that a comma goes there. However, if you have really strong feelings about the Oxford comma, I can also respect that sometimes we may not need one. But generally speaking, remember to put a comma even before the and at the end of your list. So, rule number 4, use commas to separate each item in a list when writing lists. Now, rule number 5, use commas to separate 2 or more coordinate adjectives that describe the same noun. So a coordinate adjective, or coordinate adjectives, are adjectives that describe the same word and they work together. The best way to determine whether or not they are coordinate adjectives is if you have 2 descripting words, 2 adjectives, and you can put the word and between them and the sentence still makes sense, well, then you need a comma there. Here's our example. He was a difficult, stubborn child. Now, I could rewrite that sentence and say he was a difficult and stubborn child. And for that reason, because the and still makes sense there, I know that those 2 adjectives are working together. They're coordinating. They are coordinate adjectives. And therefore, I need to put a comma between them. Now, again, coordinate adjectives can sometimes be hard to identify. If you are reading a sentence and you notice that there are 2 adjectives, 2 descriptions that are describing the same word, I would just test it using that and. And if you can put an and between them, well, then there should be a comma between them. Here's our last rule. Rule number 6. Use a comma to shift between the main discourse in a sentence and a quotation. So whenever you put a quotation in a sentence, you're going to need a comma to indicate where the quotation starts or ends and where your own writing begins. So you can see in our example, John said without emotion, comma, I'll see you tomorrow. Now, I'll see you tomorrow is the quotation. That is John speaking. And we want to offset the quotation with a comma to show where we stop talking and where John starts talking, or vice versa. If we started the sentence with John's quotation, well, then we would put a comma right when his quotation ends to indicate that we are now talking. So our comma just basically indicates who is and is not talking. When you introduce a quotation, you need to put a comma right before that quotation in order to show that a shift is occurring there. Now, we have talked about 6 rules for using commas today. Again, these are the 6 most essential rules. They are not all of the rules, but if you follow these rules, you should get most commas. Thank you for watching so much. Thank you for watching today. Really appreciate it.